As usual, we have another awesome interview for you guys today. It's Lindsay Moran. She's a former CIA operative. Her book is blowing my cover, My Life as a Spy. She did that after she came out of the agency. But mainly, I just want to talk about your experience, Lindsay. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Lindsay used to be on our current show all the time, and she was our expert on intelligence matters, etc. But the reason I wanted to do this interview, Lindsay, is because I wanted to find out how in the world you got into the CIA. How's life in the CIA? I think that's super interesting. So, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the D.C. area, suburbs of Washington, and my whole life was kind of immersed in spydom from a very early age. My dad did top secret work for the government. My grandfather, I'm pretty sure, did work for the CIA. I never was able to find out for sure. And even as a little girl, it was my childhood dream to be a spy and to someday work for the CIA.
So do you know if your father or grandfather ever killed anyone with a pen?
I'm pretty sure my dad tried to kill me with a pen when I was a teenager. But
okay, so well, if you grew up in that environment, that makes a lot more sense. Then you went to Harvard, right?
Yep.
Whoa. Okay, so then you come out of Harvard, though. Like most people coming out of Harvard think, oh, you know, I think like I'm going to be rich. I don't know what they think, right? But so when you came out, what did you think you were going to be, and what happened next?
Well, when I got out of Harvard, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, like a lot of people coming out of college. But it had always been this childhood dream of mine to be a spy. So I actually approached the CIA at that time. I was really young, I was 21, and I got the application, you know, this was pre-internet days, took it home and started to fill it out, and I kind of got cold feet. I just had this sense that I was too young to embark on this really serious career. So I ended up going to having a number of jobs, going to grad school at Columbia, and then I went to teach in Bulgaria.
Of
and
course, yeah.
Yes, as anyone would.
Right, naturally.
And I really fell in love with Bulgaria. I'd always been interested in the Soviet Union, yeah, and interested in Eastern Bloc countries. And although it was fairly dismal at that time, I just loved the country, loved living overseas, really grew fascinated with the Balkans. And by that time I was 26, and I kind of reassessed and thought, you know, if I worked for the CIA, I could combine all of these interests, my desire to live overseas, to assimilate, to learn foreign languages, and also I'd have this really exciting and glamorous career and be scaling walls in a black catsuit and blowing up safes.
Did you actually do that?
No, and that was the big disappointment when I finally did join the CIA. Is it's not quite like it's depicted in Hollywood, and certainly not as I imagined it would be.
Okay, so that's exactly what I want to talk to you about in a minute. But first, did you tell him, and was he like pro you joining the CIA, against it? What was his reaction?
Well, my dad, who I found out was not a spy, he was a naval architect and designed ships for the Navy. And so he did a lot of top secret work growing up, and which is why I thought he was a spy. But he was actually pretty opposed to me joining the agency. He didn't think the agency would take me, actually.
Wow, why?
He said, you know, if the agency wants you, they'll find you, and you're far too liberal. You know, you have to be the head of the Young Republicans Club. So it was partly a desire to fulfill my childhood dream, and maybe a little bit wanting to prove my dad wrong that I finally did approach the agency, and they were very interested, in fact. So I proved him wrong pretty early on.
Yeah, I mean, they'd be crazy not to be interested. I mean, you're coming to them, Harvard educated, you're randomly interested in Bulgaria, which no other American is, right? And you're like, oh, send me to the Balkans, like right around when the Soviet Union is melting down. Who volunteers for that? Okay, so just one last quick thing before we get to the CIA stuff. Why, of all the countries in the world, Bulgaria?
It's a kind of long story, and I won't bore you with the details, but suffice it to say I was applying for a teaching job overseas, and almost all the American high schools overseas are the sons and daughters of diplomats. And I was offered a job in Jakarta and another one in Quito, Ecuador. But this school in Bulgaria really intrigued me. It's called the American College of Sofia, and it was started by American missionaries in the late 1800s. And then when the communists took over Bulgaria, and it was all Bulgarian students, it was American teachers and Bulgarian students, really bright Bulgarian students. When the communists came to power in Bulgaria, they closed down the school, kicked all the Americans out, accused many of the Bulgarians who had been students there of being spies. So in fact, there was actually kind of a spy history to the school itself. So my class was all Bulgarian kids, 100 Bulgarian kids who had sat for an exam, basically our SATs translated into Bulgarian. They were super smart. I left there before they realized they were smarter than I was, but really neat, interesting kids.
Yeah, that's a really interesting life experience as well.
And there's also a legend surrounding the school. It was after they closed down the school, it became the headquarters of the Bulgarian secret police. And supposedly that is where they housed the assassin who made an assassination attempt against the Pope.
Oh, right, so, who happens to be a Turkish guy.
Yeah, yes.
So we bring it all the way back around. Every Turk believes that it was a Bulgarian plot. There's like they're like, oh, that guy's not Turkish. Well, he is.
Well, the Bulgarians have a place in spy lore because they were the ones who killed a guy with a poison tip umbrella. The Bulgarians.
Oh, so they were the ones who did that.
They invented the poison tip umbrella. Bulgaria's big claim to fame.
It's fascinating when someone's interested in something, they wind up being immersed in it. Like wherever you went, there was spying going on, right?
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. So finally you make it into the CIA. So my main question is always like, is it anything like in the movies where they're so smart and they got all the satellite images and they're tracking everything and they know everything? And plus, like in countries like Turkey, when I was growing, I moved here when I was 8, right? But my dad, my dad used to fight against this idea, I should say, right? But everybody else was like, oh, CIA, everything's CIA. Oh, it rained today? Come on. CIA, so obvious, right? Oh, people didn't show up to my restaurant? Effing CIA, right? So what's the reality?
Well, the reality, that's far from the case. And certainly when I joined the agency, I had this idea of it as this kind of mythical, omnipotent organization, as many Americans and as many people throughout the world do. And then you get there and it's a big bureaucracy, and it's made up of human beings, and some of them are really bright and some of them are really motivated, but some of them are asleep under their desks. And I'm not saying that figuratively. I mean, literally, I would come across people asleep under their desks at the agency.
Slash horrific.
Yeah, yes. There's a great deal, like any big organization, there's a great deal of waste, there's a great deal of incompetence. And this was all stuff that I wrote about in my book, and obviously upset a lot of people at the agency. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that the CIA is useless. They have a pretty big mandate trying to protect us, trying to know everything that's going on in the world, and there's no way that they can do that. But it's kind of astounding when you think about all the major geopolitical shifts that the agency somehow missed. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Arab Spring, one after another, things that have happened that the CIA has failed to predict. So this organization that everyone thinks makes everything happen and knows everything before it's going to happen is really far from reality.
Yeah, I hear you on that, and I don't know to what degree it is today. But look, I have a theory on what the CIA was actually meant to do back in the day. So I don't think that they were here to protect us, to be honest, okay? I think they were largely operating as a paramilitary unit of multinational corporations, right? They were there to protect the corporations, not us. So if a banana company didn't like a certain ruler in Honduras, well, then he had to go. Now, how in the world was that protecting the United States citizens? Come on, right? Oil rights, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Latin America, Venezuela, whatever it might be, all of a sudden the CIA shows up. Okay, so let me throw that at you and get your perspective on it.
Well, in fact, one of the reasons I was and remain convinced that my grandfather was a spy and worked for the agency is because he lived spent his entire career overseas, and wherever he was, there was suddenly a mysterious coup.
Oh, wow.
Several months after his arrival. So the CIA, I think its mandate is basically to protect American interests. It's kind of evolved into, and it's presented to Americans now as we're protecting you. But really, it's about protecting American interests. Stealing secrets, finding out information that the U.S. government doesn't have access to through normal diplomatic channels. And that can be, you know, yes, it can be used to protect Americans, to prevent terrorist attacks, but it also can be used to protect our economic interests.
See, bingo, there it is. Because that's, I like the way you phrase it. It's American interests, which is vague enough for them to say, well, it's in our interest to make sure that American companies do well. And how could they do well with a, you know, a ruler who actually thinks that the country should keep its bananas, right? And so that, I think that's the excuse that they use. And look, I think that I don't know that you need a CIA, but you need someone to gather intelligence to actually protect American citizens. So I get it. During the Soviet Union, we had interest there. Now against Al-Qaeda, I hope to God they're collecting information. I want to get to that in a second, et cetera. And I would hope that they're infiltrating groups. But it seemed like that was not necessarily their objective. And as you see them miss these things, so you think like, what's your point if you're missing these giant events, as you're pointing out, Arab Spring, the solution to the Soviet Union? Because I think that wasn't their point. Their point was to protect economic interests. And those so-called American companies aren't American at all. They're multinational. You're like, who owns ExxonMobil? There's not like one American dude that owns ExxonMobil. Right. And when ExxonMobil makes money, it doesn't necessarily go to Americans. It goes to their shareholders, goes to their executives who are from all over the world. So I think that's part of the issues there. But so that goes to the second thing. So back in the day, I assumed there were real spies, like inside the Soviet Union, inside Russia, and they did dangerous work and they infiltrated. I'm guessing here, so tell me if I'm wrong. But these days, I'm not convinced we've infiltrated Al-Qaeda with an agent or an operative at all.
I'm quite sure we haven't. It's close to impossible, and really recently, in the past decade specifically, we've really shifted away from that emphasis of trying to recruit insiders and trying to recruit spies. I mean, we spent, in the aftermath of September 11th, we changed our strategy so much and spent resources on gathering so-called intelligence in a way that's completely at odds with American ideals, which was, you know, creating Guantanamo, torturing people. And I mean, I'm the first to admit that the CIA is not a place for any kind of moral or ethical purist. You know, you're operating in gray areas.
Right.
And that's something that just is kind of the nature of espionage and the nature of the game, and something that ultimately I was uncomfortable with because I did go in with a kind of naive idea that I'll be out stealing secrets and thereby serving my country. And it's not quite as simple as that.
So what did you do, to the degree that you can tell us? What did you do at the agency?
Well, one thing that I think a common misconception about what a spy does, you're not really the one who's at the greatest risk. So what you're doing, basically, you're kind of like a glorified salesman in some ways, and what you're selling is treason. And you go to a foreign country, usually live there, so you're not going off on like a mission here and a mission there, typically. You're living in a foreign country. And you're trying to find people that have access to information that the U.S. government wants. So that could be, you know, someone in the military. It could be a scientist, you know, a nuclear physicist. It could be a communications director. Somebody who has information that we want, whether to set up a platform, whether to protect our economic interests, whether to monitor terrorist activities. And then you kind of get to know that person. It's like a courtship. And you try to find out, do they have access to information that you want or the U.S. government wants? And do they exhibit the characteristics that might make them a good spy? And some of this is not, you know, it's not really nice. You're manipulating them. You're trying to find out what motivates that person and also what their vulnerabilities are. You know, is he an alcoholic? Does he have a son or daughter with a crippling disease that we might be able to provide medical care for? And so you leverage that and kind of suck them into this relationship where they're giving you secret information, usually at first they might not know that you work for the CIA, but you get to a point where they should know 9 times out of 10 that they're working for the CIA.
So it seems like in some ways the art of seduction.
It is, yes. It's very much like, I liken the whole, what we call the recruitment cycle, to a courtship, and it culminates with the pitch, where you say to that person, you know, I want to enter into a formal relationship with you. You sign the secrecy agreement. You're going to give me secret information, and I'm going to give you money.
Okay, so in the beginning, you say, hey, I'm from X and Y company, and you pretend you ran into them. So they don't know you're CIA in the beginning, obviously.
Right.
Right, but, and then you, what's our plate of options, right? Like, it's money obviously is a huge one. Is sex number 2?
We're not supposed to, and we don't, female CIA officers, as I was, or operatives, you're not supposed to use sex as a means of getting information or starting a relationship. In fact, you're forbidden from having any kind of romantic entanglements with your foreign agents, although it does happen. It happens more often with the male CIA operatives who get involved with the safe housekeepers or the. But there are such things as honey traps, but they typically would not be a person who went to an American. You know, we might hire someone in Russia to be a honey trap over there.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. First of all, I didn't know the term honey trap. I already love it. Second of all, the agents having, or the operatives having sex with the safe housekeeping people sounds fun. Although I'm sure
it does happen.
Right. So I'm frowning upon it as we speak. But I like whenever it's a Chinese spy here in America, it's almost like 9 out of 10, at least in the stories that make it into the public, it's a woman and she wound up having sex with a guy and the guy was like, oh my God, I'll tell you everything.
Right.
Right. So I figured that that operatives would hook them up with whoever that we thought they wanted so that we become friendly and yada yada. So does that happen a decent amount?
Well, the CIA is a little bit nerdier than most other spy services. So we typically don't send a honey trap out. I'm going to keep using that word as much as possible
please.
Since I know you like it.
Yes.
After someone. But I will say that in the role I was in as a what's called an ops officer, an operations officer, I found that the women, we had a distinct advantage over our male colleagues, just in that most of our targets are men, and it was relatively easy for us to go up and strike up a conversation with a foreign man. Typically, they don't suspect us of being spies, and then they start to brag about their, their top secret work. And
that's awesome. Okay.
So yeah, so there's all these advantages you have as a female operative. There are also added challenges, which is that you're kind of engaging in this courtship. You're getting this guy to give you information, and then telling him, like, you can't tell anybody about our relationship, and in fact we're going to have to meet in really secret places and late at night, maybe even hotel rooms. So you're giving him all these signals, and inevitably he gets the wrong idea. I've never known a female ops officer who has not had that situation where she's had to make it clear to her agent, her foreign agent, that this is not about sex, that this is a business relationship. And I personally always found it a relief when I got to that point. I was always wanting to get to that point where I could make it clear that I worked for the U.S. government so that he would know what was going on. Right.
So if money, sex, what else is in the top 3 for luring in agents?
Well, being a good spy or a good operative is all about figuring out what motivates people and what their vulnerabilities are. So sometimes it's like a guy who you get to know and he's underappreciated at work. He doesn't like his boss or whatever. So then you make him feel good. You're giving all this really important information, and I'm taking this information and I'm securely communicating it back to Washington. And I just want you to know that they think this is great. And you make him feel like a hero, kind of play upon his ego. And that's a remarkably effective way to manipulate someone. They want to give you more information. You tell them that the information that that they're giving you maybe is getting before the eyes of the President of the United States. You know, this is a huge ego trip for these guys.
That makes so much sense. Because what's the one thing guys want more than anything else? Appreciation. They want affirmation, and they want to feel like, yes, I am important. I am an important person. Look at what I did. And like, if they're smart, wives and girlfriends use that to good effect all the time. So it makes sense that you would use it in a professional context too. And I remember, I mean, when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I just worked there briefly as a summer intern when I was in law school. And I remember the chief prosecutor there said, at the end of a case, he said, "I thank you and the Bureau thanks you." And I was like, oh, does it? You know, so it totally worked on me.
Yeah.
So, and I can see how that would work. So when you get to the moment where you tell them, hey, by the way, psych, I'm CIA, right? What percentage of the time were they like, okay, we got a deal, and what percentage of the time did they walk away?
I never had anyone walk away, and you're really trained to recognize the clues. You don't want to pitch someone unless you're pretty darn sure that he's going to say yes. I mean, I had one guy who, when I revealed to him that I worked for the CIA, he said, "I love CIA, you know, like, where do I sign?" And that was actually my first recruitment, so it was this wave of relief. But yeah, I never had anyone walk away because they really should know at that point. You should have been dropping enough clues. You know, you're alluding to, you're conveying the information through secret and secure channels. You know, nobody else knows about the relationship. So you've dropped enough clues that if they don't know that you're CIA, then, you know, you probably don't want an agent who's that dense anyway.
Okay, I'm going to make a totally inappropriate analogy, as I often do. I once interviewed a transgendered woman, and she said almost the same exact thing. You drop enough clues that by the time they find out, they already knew.
Exactly.
Right? Because you don't want any surprises, right?
So yeah, so being a CIA spy is very much like being a transgender. and we have some of those too.
Oh, is that right? Okay, that's a different kind of honey trap.
Yeah, but yeah, you don't. You want to minimize the possibility of blowback.
Here we go again.
Yeah, just you want to minimize the possibility that they're going to, you know, scream and run and report you to the Minister of the Interior.
That's exactly the next question I wanted to ask you, actually. If you get a sense that, oh my God, this guy's onto me and he's not into it, right? In terms of like he gets that I'm from the U.S. government. Even if it didn't happen to you, obviously it must happen to some people, either at the moment of truth or before that. Does that mean you're burned and you got to leave the country right away?
No, not at all. In fact, you know, on the one hand, your cover is like your shield of armor, but on the other hand, over the course of a career, your cover erodes. You know, if you're really aggressive and you're out and you're running operations all the time and you're spotting, assessing, and developing and recruiting, over time, your cover might erode a little bit, and people might have suspicions that you're CIA. And then we also have, you know, we have declared officers where they're in the country and the host government knows who the CIA people are. I was not a declared officer, but it shouldn't be the case that if your cover's blown, your career's over at all.
Okay, that's interesting. So now I want to get back to the infiltration, et cetera. Did we have people that were deep in the Soviet government? Do you know at all? Like, did we used to do what was in the movies where a guy would assimilate and he would seem Russian and he would get into the Soviet government? Or was that all a myth?
The Russians are a lot better at doing that. To my knowledge, we've never been able to do that. And frankly, I think during the Cold War, the kind of spy versus spy game between us and the Russians, I really think they had us beat at the end of the day. I think the KGB was a more sophisticated service. Their language capabilities were a lot better. Americans, the kind of Americans that the CIA attracts, there's very few of them that actually have language capabilities to the point that they could pose as a native. Now, we certainly did have many sources, Soviet sources, you know, deep within the Soviet government and high-level sources. And that was a time, you know, there's a lot of people at the CIA who are very nostalgic for the Cold War because that was a time when we could infiltrate our enemies, the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc, and we could find people who were disaffected with that system and make the argument to them, you know, we're the Americans, we're the good guys, we've got this great standard of living. And all of those tactics that we developed during the Cold War, they don't really apply to terrorists. That they don't work with Al-Qaeda guys or any of them.
They don't believe we're the good guys?
No, they don't believe they're the good guys. They don't care how much money we throw at them. They fervently hate the United States and hate Americans. And so these are this is a much more difficult enemy that we're dealing with. So naturally, people at the agency are very nostalgic for those simple days of the Cold War when there was kind of like a mutual respect almost between us and the KGB. Not to say that, you know, that we weren't surveilling each other and spying on each other, and we still do. But a friend of mine who served in Moscow, a former colleague of mine, he has this great story. You know, in Moscow, you're followed all the time by, at that time, the KGB, and now the SVR, the FSB. And there's surveillance on you all the time. So there's very little you can do operationally if you're serving in a place like Moscow. And he'd been living there for a number of years. They adopted a dog while they were there, and they had to take the dog and have it put down. And as he left the vet's office after having had the dog put down, he walked out, and one of his surveillance, one of these KGB guys surveilling him, came up and put his arm around him and said, you know, I'm really sorry, I feel really bad. I was with you when you got that dog.
Yeah, that's awesome. See, that's old school. Yeah. That's nice. Like, that actually makes me feel a little better. Like, at least people were doing their jobs.
Yeah.
Right? So now I feel like if I was a president, I would be livid at the CIA for not having infiltrated Al-Qaeda. I mean, how many years in now? Over 12 years in. How could we not have a guy? I feel like the number 4 guy at Al-Qaeda should be CIA. Yeah,
he should. And the CIA, bizarrely, is always kind of like a little bit behind the 8 ball. You know, even when I went through my training in 1998, you know, we knew that Osama bin Laden was our main enemy. We knew about Al-Qaeda.
When was that?
1998.
In 98, you knew bin Laden was the main enemy.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't a household name, but certainly at the CIA. I mean, when we did weapons qualification, we shot at pictures of Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein.
Wow.
And that was, you know, right after the embassy bombings in Africa, but. Still, we were being trained with this training paradigm that they've used since the OSS times, you know, going out on the diplomatic cocktail circuit, where you're never going to run into Osama bin Laden.
Right. I don't think they drink cocktails.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda,
yeah.
If I'm not mistaken.
So, you know, the CIA is a culture that is very slow to change, and that it's not a nimble organization, and that's really unfortunate because for intelligence collection, you really need an organization that can change quickly. I mean, look, even today. With so we got Osama bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda was. We thought that our Al-Qaeda fears were going to be gone, and now we see, you know, there's all kinds of little terrorist offshoot groups popping up everywhere, and I guarantee the CIA has no information on that.
Ah, that's really disappointing. So, and one last thing about that, is it that they're too risk-averse? So, like, if I was a president, you know, I wouldn't want to, like, they think these days presidents think they're tough guys if they start wars, etc. But to me, the CIA, military, special forces, etc., their job is to risk their lives, right? So that's a really, really tough ask of someone, but you've got to ask them that. You can't get cautious in those categories. And I would tell the CIA, guys, I need you to risk your life. That's what you signed up for. I need you to infiltrate. Is that why they're not doing it, that they're worried they're going to lose people and they're risk-averse in that sense?
I think the CIA doesn't really attract people who are willing to go the distance like that, and I would include myself in it. You know, I don't know that I would be willing to try to infiltrate a terrorist group. In fact, I know that I probably would not. It's an incredibly risky thing to do. But I think the issue is we ask our military, the guys in the military, to take those risks. You know, they risk their lives all the time. And the CIA, I think, is not willing to do that.
Wow. Okay, so I think that's a common misconception that people have. I think they think CIA, you go in, you risk your life, you're a spy, that's what spies do, but apparently not. So you left in 2003, right? Mm-hmm. So why did you leave?
I left for two reasons. Partly personal, because it's an incredibly lonely life. It's a really, really hard place to be if you want to have any kind of personal relationships, you know, with your family, if you ever want to get married to someone other than the jerks who work at the CIA. So there was that aspect of just, you know, this is really hard, having to lie to people all the time. I'd always kind of been an open person and loved living overseas, but living overseas as a spy and a kind of predator was a very different experience. So that was the personal aspect. The main reason I left the agency, though, was ideological. I was in Russian language training in 2002, and then I was taken out of Russian language training and surged into a group called Iraqi Operations. And I was working at headquarters at Langley, but we were working basically giving support to CIA people and the military out in the field as we were building up to the war in Iraq. I was not a specialist on Iraq or the Middle East, or certainly not WMD, but you become an expert very quickly at the agency when you're immersed in something. And so every day I was reading in the Washington Post and hearing the members of the administration say that Saddam Hussein was a direct threat, that he had weapons of mass destruction, that he was linked with Al-Qaeda. And then I would go into work at the CIA where I was working with people who this was their area of expertise. And to a person, they said, we have no evidence of WMD. There's no link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me in terms of disillusionment with the agency. And I wasn't there for a particular conversation, but it was reported to me by a colleague who worked in the counterproliferation division that a manager gathered his group together of about 20 to 30 CIA people and said, look, let's face it, the president wants to go to war and our job is to give him a reason to do so. And this was kind of shocking to me because that's not the job of the CIA, or certainly not the job of the CIA as I saw it, or that's not what I signed up for. Mm-hmm. I wanted to serve my country, and I became aware that I was not serving my country. I was serving this organization. And the organization was not serving the country. It was serving the wishes at that time of the administration.
So there was a couple of wow moments in that answer. Now, if you were paying attention, you knew before the Iraq War that Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11 and Al-Qaeda. And even the Bush administration, they would be misleading rather than outright lying oftentimes. They would put them in the same sentence, but they wouldn't say Saddam did 9/11. They did on one or two occasions, right. But generally it was a campaign to mislead people. And it was obvious, but the press wouldn't report on it. It was maddening at the time. But we at least knew that was the case. But we had the impression that the CIA thought that yes, that he did have weapons of mass destruction. Like we thought, okay, the CIA got that wrong. Are you saying that inside the CIA, they also knew, no, he doesn't have weapons of mass destruction?
Every single analyst that I talked to, whether they were working on WMD or Iraq, said that we had no evidence of WMD. Not to say that we knew there wasn't any, but we had no evidence that there was any.
That's amazing. So I don't know if you knew enough people at the time, et cetera, to give us a general reaction, but when Colin Powell went to go give that speech at the UN, what were you thinking? What were your colleagues thinking? Like, whoa, what in the world is happening? Or
I was really kind of baffled and confused. The CIA, though, it's not a place where people sit around and philosophize and debate. You know, you're kind of a foot soldier when you're there, and you're just doing what you're supposed to do. And I think there was certainly not, it's not a place where if you voice concerns, dissent, disagreement with any policies, that's going to be viewed upon favorably.
Yeah, so, I suspect not.
Yeah. No. And when I left, right around that time also was when I started to hear in the hallways about our enhanced interrogation technique program. I didn't know anyone directly involved with it, but I knew people who had been approached and asked if they wanted to be trained to conduct these kind of interrogations. And that was very troubling to me too. And another reason that I just wanted to get out.
All right, so let me tie it back to the present now and ask you one more question in regards to what we're doing. So, you know, it's now I understand the CIA better, having had this conversation. It's a bureaucracy, and if a train is going in a certain direction, people are going to go with it, et cetera. But I wonder why the train goes in a certain direction. So in particular, in regards to drone strikes that we're doing now. So it appears from what I've read from the press, the president is often told, you've got to do this, okay? And this is better than the big war, and that's the rationale they use for the drone strikes. And if you were directing it at Al-Qaeda's number 2 or number 7, that would make some sense, right? But we do something called signature strikes, where we literally do drone strikes on people. We have no idea what their identity is. We don't know who they are. We're like, there's a signature of activity down there, guns, whatever it might be, large trucks, whatever they use. Let's just kill them just to be safe, right? That seems so morally unconscionable. How does a train head in that direction? So what's your sense of why they think they need to do that? And especially because it seems from every report on the ground that it's counterproductive. Everyone in Yemen, because of the drone strikes, now despises America because they know innocent people who died, and they think America is the big guy in the sky who murders us every once in a while, and they claim they get terrorists, but I know they hit a wet, right? So it's counterproductive. So why did the train go in that direction?
I think because, to go back to what we were talking about before, we don't seem to have any well-placed sources. So we're just sticking with this, well, let's go out and kill them all. And I think this is a real mistake, and we're reaping what we sow at this point. I mean, all of these terrorist groups that are sprouting up everywhere, I think that's in direct response to the drone program and the fact that we've killed countless civilians. You never hear about it. Americans never hear about it. We don't know the identities of any of those people who are killed. And it's very disappointing, because I felt like after the war in Iraq, we were so unpopular. And then I thought maybe we would yet again experience this era of popularity. And I really think Obama has pretty much furthered all the programs of the Bush administration in terms of national security, and squandered the goodwill that he had when he was first elected.
Yeah, somebody just sent me an old video I did back in '08 when Cheney said, oh, Obama will do everything we did. And I remember at the time saying, like, oh, that's ridiculous. I mean, the guy campaigned on change. And I wasn't all about rainbows and unicorns. I didn't think he was going to be the end-all, be-all. But I thought, well, I mean, he's at least going to change these heinous programs. And we didn't get much change, as you point out. And I guess I'm curious about the mechanics behind that, so that no matter what guy we put in that office, and no matter how much he says he's going to change things, we get the same exact result.
We do, yeah. I mean, I think that Americans have been so conditioned during the past decade to kind of act on fear. You know, we were manipulated into to fearing after 9/11, to being a fearful people and acting out with that as our motivation. And I think that's where the drone strikes, it's easier. It's certainly easier to send in a drone than it is to infiltrate or try to understand the psychology of these groups. And this is another criticism of the intelligence community at large, is that we tend to think that just by killing these people, that's going to take our problems away. And it's not. And there's never really the attempt to really understand the psychology of these groups. Why do they hate us so much? What kind of people are attracted to these groups? And why can't we get someone in there, you know, under deep cover? We should be doing that.
I wish you'd go back to the CIA and run it, but I don't think that's what's going to happen.
I don't think I'll be invited, but
it doesn't sound like it. Lindsay Moran, the book is called Blowing My Cover, My Life as a Spy. As you can tell, absolutely fascinating stories. Lindsay, this was incredibly educational. Thank you so much
for
doing
me.
it.
It was fun.